I'm excited to introduce Stephen Bingler from New Orleans, Concordia, and the Unified Plan for Rebuild New Orleans.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. And I want to make a correction. I am from New Orleans, but I'm actually from Virginia. And I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. And more important, I'm a hillbilly. My cousin, June Carter, was married to Johnny Cash. So I'm a bona fide hillbilly. I love these mountains, and it's so delightful to me and I kind of want to thank Betsy Del Monte for taking me in and giving me this big suite, a bedroom, and overlooking these beautiful mountains. And I just feel so, and plus we don't get snow that much in New Orleans, although this year we got 10 inches. Can you believe that? But anyway, I just wanted to say, most of all, I'm just delighted to be here. And the reason I'm here is, as Ryan said, is to share as much as I can about the experiences that we went through 20 years ago. That you are entering into a very exciting time, a very challenging time, that will bring not only challenges, but a lot of opportunities as well. So I know it doesn't feel like it right now, and I've been there. In New Orleans, my family and I had to leave and go to Manhattan for a year. And we lived in 6 different places, and the community took us in. We got free tuition for our kids at schools, and so it's important more than anything that we're all in this together. And so my purpose for being here is to share with you some of our experiences so that you don't have to go down the same dark alleys that we went down sometimes, and maybe that you can benefit from some of the things that turned out well for us. So I want to start by saying that that in New Orleans there were actually a number of planning processes. The first planning process started with the mayor's office. Mayor Nagin, who you see in the picture there on the right, turned to a real estate developer named Joe Cannizzaro, who built most of the high-rise buildings downtown, and said, could you help organize a planning process for recovery in New Orleans? Well, it didn't end so well because Joe Cannizzaro put together a plan. It was a top-down plan. It was a plan that didn't engage anybody in the community. It didn't even engage the director of the Planning Commission. It was a plan that was developed in a back room. And when that plan was presented at the Sheraton Hotel ballroom with 1,000 people in the room, the gentleman on the right, lower right, stood up and he said, Mr. Cannizzaro, the real estate developer, he said, I'm from the lower Ninth Ward, and the plan that Mr. Cannizzaro had presented talked about how the lower Ninth Ward wouldn't be able to come back because it was at a too low elevation. And there were a number of other areas in the city that would not be allowed to rebuild. And that gentleman said, Mr. Cannizzaro, I don't know you, but I hate you. And it went downhill from there because people got up one after the other. And the mayor ended up leaving by the back door. And that was the end of the mayor's Bring New Orleans Back plan. Then the city council stepped in, and they said, well, we always knew the mayor was an idiot anyway, so, but we're smart. We're smarter than the mayor, and we know how to do this, so we're going to do a plan. So the city council stepped in and created a plan that they called the Neighborhoods Rebuilding Plan. And the Neighborhoods Rebuilding Plan had some community engagement, but they limited all of their planning to the parts of the city that got 2 feet of water or more. And they said, we're not going to plan for the whole city. We're just going to plan for the people who got the worst impact. So when the city council's plan was presented to the state, and the state said, no, I don't think we can accept a partial plan for the city. We have to have a full plan for the city. And so that plan was rejected. So now it's the spring. The storm happened in August. So now it's the spring of 2006. And Darren Walker, who was a program officer at the Rockefeller Foundation, stepped in and gave a direction to the local community foundation that he was willing to fund a community plan, but that it needed to have a lot of community involvement. So that's when we got involved in organizing that plan, and it's called the Unified New Orleans Plan. And the plan, as I said, the funding came primarily from the Rockefeller Foundation through the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And then an organization was created called the New Orleans Community Support Foundation. So this was a philanthropic organization. No more government. It was a philanthropic organization that led the plan. And our job was to essentially staff that plan for the planning process and to design the planning process. And then we created a community support organization, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And we ended up producing a citywide plan and neighborhood plans. This is kind of a stack of all of the organizations all the way up from the federal government to the Louisiana Recovery Authority, to the mayor's office, to city council, to the planning commission, and then this organization. It's all of those organizations that had to come together and agree on what the plan, or sign off on the plan at the end before most of the federal money could start flowing into the city. So we established a series of ground rules that everything had to be transparent, it had to be data-driven, it had to be based on best practices nationally and internationally, and that it would exceed all of the state and federal and local planning guidelines. That every citizen had a right to return to New Orleans. That wasn't a given, by the way, in some of the other plans. And that the decisions to return or not to return were based on individual choice, supported by the data that came from the process, and that we would use all of that community information to develop the plan. There were, as I mentioned, there were other plans involved. You can see all the plans, the Bringing New Orleans Back Commission plan, the Lambert was called neighborhood plans, also sometimes called the Lambert plan, the independent neighborhood plans, the FEMA plans, and the Louisiana state plans all had to come together into one plan. In order to do that, we established an independent support organization called the Community Support Organization, and it wasn't the city council, it wasn't the mayor's office, the city council people appointed people from their district to sit on this independent commission. And this independent commission was responsible, literally met in the city council chambers. And we presented every week progress, and they gave direction. As I said, the plan was actually developed across the whole city, in this time with the planning director very much involved in the process. The city has already divided up into 13 planning districts. And so we consolidated that. One of those planning districts is very kind of rural, and so we consolidated 3 of those, and so we ended up with 10 planning districts. We then put out an RFP, national RFP, and we hired 12 urban planning firms to come and help deliver the plan. both the citywide plan and the neighborhood plans. There's 73 neighborhoods in New Orleans. And you might want to think about that in terms of this region, right? Because everybody talks about, well, there's Asheville, right? But then there are all these other communities like Swannanoa and Chimney Rock and other places that are kind of like neighborhoods in some ways, just farther removed, right? So a lot more space in between the neighborhoods. But in New Orleans, we have 73 neighborhoods. They are all very different. If you don't think so, just ask them. They'll tell you, my neighborhood's not like your neighborhood. My neighborhood is special to me. And we do things different than you guys do. So we had to be thinking not only about planning at the citywide level, we had to be thinking about every one of those neighborhoods is special. And every one of those neighborhoods needs special treatment. So when we hired these 12 urban planning firms, we put them all in a big room in City Park called the Pavilion of Two Sisters. It's a giant room, maybe 5 times bigger than this room. And we put the planners all around the outside in booths. And we invited the community. 650 people showed up to interview the planners that they wanted in their neighborhood. And we were nervous at first because we thought, what if everybody picks the same planner? It just turned out, it was one of those miracles that happens sometime, that everybody got the planner. They're either their first or second choice. And sometimes you just have to sort of trust the process and just turn it over. And to, democracy actually does work. So this is how we divided all those planners up into all of these different district plans and the neighborhood plans and the citywide plan. On the left is the series of plans that took place. First was a citywide plan, and then it went to 4 different plans happening at the same time. And it kept kind of toggling back and forth between the citywide plans and the district plans. And we had, in one citywide meeting, because everybody cares so much about planning. Maybe when you're doing a comprehensive plan, not everybody wants to come down and spend a couple hours learning about land use or zoning or whatever. But when we have this kind of planning, when everybody's life is at stake, then people want to participate. We had 9,000 people involved in the planning for New Orleans recovery. 9,000 people. In one meeting, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, we had 1,500 people in one room at the convention center. And then we had 2-way broadcast television to Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, and Baton Rouge. Because there were so many people living in the diaspora, what we call the diaspora, they couldn't get back. Some of them were musicians and artists and people who, didn't have the resources to come home. So we had to reach out to them. We had to go get to churches and let people know that their meetings were taking places and that kind of thing. It's hard work, It's almost like a political campaign. You really have to get out there in the trenches and make sure that people understand that they have this planning process is their planning process. It's not the government's planning process. So anyway, this is a photograph of that meeting that I just described. And each one of those 2-way broadcast television screens, this was before Zoom. This was like the Today Show, where it was that expensive and that elaborate. You can see the size of those screens. And there, at some points, people would be waving at each other. They would be seeing people they hadn't seen for a long time. It was really fun. It was very serious. And one of the questions that we had that we asked in this meeting was we asked people to identify their ethnicity because it was really important that we had promised the mayor that we would try to get 65% African American participation because that was the percentage of African American citizenship in New Orleans. And so we wanted to be sure that the process was equitable and egalitarian. And so we had clickers at each one of the tables, and so we asked people to identify themselves by their ethnicity. And it was another one of those miracles I just described. 64% African American participation. It was one of the best days of my entire political career. I mean, professional career. After the New Orleans plan was finished, the Unified New Orleans plan was finished, it went through the whole process. The mayor approved it because, he was the one who said, we met his criteria, we met the city council's criteria, it all got approved, and then the money started flowing. During that process, other plans took place. We did this plan for the school system. One of the things that came out of the Unified New Orleans plan is people said, why do we have schools that are just schools? Why can't we have schools that are emergency recovery centers? Why can't we have schools that also have health clinics in the schools so that when our parents that have two jobs, that they don't have time to take their kids to school, much less also to the doctor and the dentist and all that. So how come we don't have schools that are community schools? So we actually did a plan for the city for all the new schools to become community schools, where the gymnasium becomes a community fitness center and the auditorium becomes a community performing arts center. And the ball fields are shared, with the soccer teams and neighborhood soccer teams and that kind of thing. And then I wanted to show you what happened to that in a minute. But we also, the Unified New Orleans plan also fed up into a comprehensive plan. And what I said before was that recovery planning is actually different than comprehensive planning. Recovery planning is more like emergency planning, whereas comprehensive planning is, all the stuff that planners learn in planning school. The recovery plan is building it while you're flying it most of the time. I'm sure everybody in this room knows what that feels like because you're right in the middle of it right now. It feels like chaos. That's what it's kind of supposed to feel like at this stage, just so you know. If it was anything different, you would be very abnormal. But anyway, the comprehensive plan was actually delivered by one of our planners that we brought in to help with the Unified New Orleans plan. So all the ideas that were generated during the Unified New Orleans plan just bubbled right up into the comprehensive plan. We also had another plan that was developed in New Orleans called the New Orleans Urban Water Plan. And one of my colleagues named David Wagner, who was an architect, spent time in Netherlands meeting with planners and people in the Netherlands who have been living with water for 1,000 years. And so why wouldn't we learn from them? Why wouldn't you learn from New Orleans? We learned from the Netherlands. And so we're all in this together, right? So the Netherlands actually sent scientists to New Orleans, and we actually developed a plan that says, we don't have to depend on our levee systems. In some cases, we just build big containers so that we let the water in and the water fills up the bathtub, and then when the storm is gone, we empty the bathtub and we're all good. But the bathtub might be City Park, right? So that was a really important part of the New Orleans Comprehensive Plan, too, was that the Dutch dialogues fed into the New Orleans plan and created a number also of changes to the building codes. So now in New Orleans, if you're an architect and you're designing a commercial building, you have to take the first 2 inches of rain and you have to keep it on your site. You can't just let it flow into the storm system. You have to detain that water long enough that the rest of the city can catch up. That's a radical change that happened to our building codes. And there were many other smaller changes that happened to the building code because we learned that lesson. You don't need to learn that lesson. We learned it already. I'm sharing it with you right now, right? So, and there are so many other lessons that we're going to talk about where we can save you some time and effort, and by sharing things that we already know. Everything I've talked about so far have been kind of challenges, right? We've been addressing the challenges. Some of you might be familiar with this Chinese character because it has been said many times that this character actually represents two things, challenge and opportunity. So it's almost the same character for both of those things. What it represents is that there's an inflection point. When you have a challenge and you face that challenge, there's a point after which your solution to that challenge becomes opportunity. And what happened in New Orleans, for example, is we got $14 billion to redo our levee system. That's a great opportunity. Came from a challenge. We wouldn't have gotten that money except for Hurricane Katrina. The levee system wasn't built as strong as it should have been. Corps of Engineers didn't do it right. So we think with $14 billion worth of extra money, this time we hope they got it right. So now our bathtub is super strong bathtub. Also, we got an extra $2 billion to redo the stormwater drainage system. So this is actually my street. That's my house right there on the right. And in the street, we have all these brand new pipes, these beautiful pipes that are this big. And the old pipes, some of them were actually made of wood, because New Orleans is an old city. So the pipes have been now replaced and upgraded. So when the water comes, it's a lot easier to get back out to the lake through the pumping system. The other thing is that we got $1 billion worth of new public housing projects. Every single public housing project in the city was demolished and rebuilt. And the one at the bottom is what it looked like before, those old tenements that came from the 1950s and 60s. And on the top is what it looks like now. They're based on principles of new urbanism and high quality of life and open space and shared space and all the things that we hope for in our neighborhoods. We also got $2 billion for new schools based on that concept of community schools I just described. It's a little more complicated, I do want to say, because another one of the transformations that took place in New Orleans, New Orleans is now a 100% charter school system. Our public school is actually all charter schools. So, it is a little more complicated for the charter schools to decide it's okay for the community to use the ball field and for the community to use the auditorium, but the buildings were designed that way, and some of the charter schools do it. The charter schools also incorporate all kinds of really cool gardens and things, they call it edible schoolyard. So the kids are actually growing vegetables in their schoolyard, and they're eating those vegetables in their cafeteria and that kind of thing. Some really neat things are happening in the school system that wouldn't have been there but for the planning process, but also because of the impetus of the storm. We also have a $1.1 billion university medical center that was built right after Hurricane Katrina. And I recommend these two publications, which I think both are priceless. One of them is called Clear as Mud, and it was written, it's a more technical document. It's really written for planners. It's got all the details of the recovery process that you would ever want to know about. It was written by two PhD planners who have specialized their careers in disaster recovery planning. All the way back, they worked with us on the plan as well as advisors, and they go all the way back to earthquakes in Kobe, Japan, and they learned those lessons there, and they shared those lessons with us, just like I'm sharing lessons with you today. And there's a wonderful African expression, West African expression called Ubuntu, if you have never heard it, and it means I am because we are. And I sort of feel like that's kind of the theme that we all need to work with in this process. is that we're all in it together. The second book on the right was written by a journalist by the name of Jed Horn. It's a lot more easy reading. It's more like personal stories, stories about people's lives after Hurricane Katrina and what it was like to live through that process. So I recommend if you want to take a little bit deeper dive, that you might want to get one of these books and read it. There was even more research and development that was done after Katrina that was spurred by Katrina. One of those was, I mentioned the Dutch dialogues, and because of the Dutch dialogues and the amazing relationship that was developed between Louisiana and the Netherlands, that Louisiana built in Baton Rouge a place called the Water Institute. And you can see on the upper right, it's a fairly consequential institute. And all of the universities in the state participate in this institute. And on the lower right is actually a model, a scale model of the Mississippi River that is a massive scale. So they can actually clock and study water movements along the Mississippi River in real time, in a real place, not just computer simulated. So it's a very important thing that wouldn't have happened except for the fact that New Orleans was struck by a major hurricane. There was another planning process that took place South Louisiana that we were also involved in 6 parishes in South Louisiana, all the parishes that are along the Gulf Coast. And in that process, we had an additional 2,700 people involved in understanding what their risks are, understanding what important decisions they needed to be making about the future. Some of those decisions this was like 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago that we did this work. And some of those people, it was their first time that they really got information that they needed to know about whether they should be thinking about staying around or whether they should maybe think about moving further north. And part of the information had to do not with zoning or that some state rule was going to tell people they had to leave, but it has to do with insurance rates. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much, everybody wants to stay where they are. Let's face it. Nobody wants to say, I'm just going to pick my whole family up and move to some other place. You would be a little bit abnormal if you felt that way. But sometimes conditions demand that you have to consider those options. So this was a very heartwarming process, and it was also a public engagement kind of process. And out of that process also came another project that Rockefeller Foundation funded us to do, which is a report which is on our website, concordia.com, called Sea Changes. And so we literally, you see all those photographs of people. 80 of the most prominent environmental and disaster recovery planners in the world, we assembled together, and we did a 3-year study to look at what are some of the lessons learned from Katrina and some of the lessons learned from LA Safe that we really all needed to be looking into for the future of planning around climate impacts. So some of the lessons that we've learned I'm going to share with you are, first of all, that we have to have inclusion. It has to be an inclusive process. We have to have as many people involved. It takes all of us. It's not something that a few planners can do in a back room. If anything, I want to be sure that I've communicated that in examples that I've shown you. Yes, it takes longer. Yes, it's harder. But it doesn't mean you have to stop until everybody's engaged or the plan is finished You actually have a bunch of things happening at once. You have a kind of a short-term set of issues that you have to resolve right now because the money's available or because the bridge is out and the bridge has got to get rebuilt or something's going to happen and you're going to look back later on and say, I wish I'd done it differently, but we had to get it done right then. Then there are other things that are sort of midterm things that you want to start planning for now because they're only going to be 6 months away before you're going to have to make those decisions. And then there are other decisions that aren't going to fully impact you for another 5 or 10 years. But you need at least to have those on your radar screen so that you're at least thinking about those all at the same time. And this all at the same time is maybe the most important part of the planning because in planning schools, we're all trained to think about physical planning. And you'll notice most of the language that you hear from planners has to do with some physical thing. Or in some cases, it's economic. So it's about money or it's about something that you can hit with a hammer and it makes a noise. However, in recovery planning, cultural planning is just as important, if not more important, than the physical planning. Social planning, planning for social programs to support people while we're in this process where people have to live somewhere, kids have to be going to school somewhere, people have to have medical care. So we have to be planning social services at the same time and make sure we've got all that covered. And then we have economic planning, and then we have organizational planning. There are a lot of different organizations that crop up that didn't even exist before. Or if the organizations did exist, maybe they're taking on new roles. They're stopping what they did before and they're focusing more on recovery, and because we all have to. So there's a whole organizational planning process that has to take place. And then there's, even more important, an educational process. Everybody needs to know. There needs to be transparency. Everybody needs to know what's going on, and everybody becomes a kind of climate planner, citizen planner. So it's not, you don't hand it over to some graduates from no matter what fancy school they graduated from. They're not qualified to do this work. It only works when we do it together. And so what I just described is actually a systemic and organic process that's a lot more like, as I said, it includes physical planning, cultural planning, social planning, economic planning, organizational and educational planning, all at the same time. I know it sounds complicated, but it's necessary. And we're actually developing a model that we call a Nexus Framework, where we plug all that into the planning model. And in this case, we're actually taking there's a very, very prominent systems a theorist named Fritjof Capra, who has identified four principles, what he calls the principles of life, and then there are some quality of life indicators developed by a woman named Hazel Henderson, and we're trying to marry all of those together into this very same document and process. And in addition to that, we have, which we're happy to share with you, actually a community engagement process or a community participation process that sometimes people have we were just talking earlier about, do we have to call it community engagement because we're kind of tired of that? Is there another word for it? I don't know, but we all know what it is, no matter what we call it. It's everybody coming together and working together. Anyway, that there is a method to that madness. It can't just be, let's have a big room. It can't just be me standing up here and talking to you guys with a PowerPoint presentation, frankly. This is not community engagement. Community engagement is all you guys talking to each other. And this is what that looks like, if I can make it work. This is actually a meeting that we just had about a month ago. See what's happening? Everybody's talking to each other. Everybody's working with each other. There's not a planner in front of the room like me talking. This is what the process needs to look like, right? We always like to have tables of 8 people. And somebody at that table is helping to facilitate the process because they've been trained about how to manage 8 people and make sure one person's not doing all the talking. and all of that. And then what we usually do is we have table sheets, we call it, and it's actually a game, so it's fun. You know, everybody's contributing, they're writing all over the pages, and then we go back and collect all the information and feed it back and say, is this what you said? Is this what we heard? Let's make sure we got it right. So it ends up being the people's plan, not the planner's plan. So I'm going to give you these 3 lessons that we learned. One of them is that recovery plan, as I said, recovery planning is not master planning. It's not the same thing. It's a very special thing that involves a lot more bottom-up thinking than top-down thinking. It has to be grounded in a compassion and entrepreneurship through a process built around authentic community engagement. Authentic. Not, you know, planners coming in and saying, you know, here's a bunch of boards that we developed that are really shiny and nice. Hope you like it. The meeting's over. You know, go home. That's not it. The second thing that we've learned is that the framework for recovery planning is not linear and sequential, but it's rather, as I mentioned, it's a complex system of parameters that include all the physical, cultural, social, economic, organizational, educational domains of community life. The third thing is that a well-executed recovery plan must create tangible returns and an unprecedented level of civic determination to stay the course and to own the outcomes. I can't say enough. This is not really what you elected your officials for. It's much bigger than that. You know, you are the community. And all of your elected officials had a full-time job even before Katrina or before Helene came roaring up the valleys. So it's not reasonable to think that they can just add another thing onto everything that they were already doing. So it does take all of us together doing this work. It's just way too much to think that you can just hand this off and somebody else is going to do it for you, like picking up your trash or something. So those are the three important lessons. And then I want to leave you with a little bit of a challenge. First of all, we talked about some challenges, and then we talked about the opportunities that came out of those challenges. But now we have to face the fact that even more challenges are lying ahead of us. So and now we had a conversation this morning with some planners, and I think that part of the conversation was, well, we do need to plan for the recovery of flooding, and that's going to be a pretty important task. But while we're doing that, we also need to be remembering that the earth is heating up. You know, I'm not here to say whose fault it is. I don't know if God did it. You know, I don't know if Exxon did it. You know, we could spend all day trying to debate whose fault it is. But the fact of the matter is 93% of the scientists are telling us, and the thermometers are telling us that January was the hottest month of all time. And December was the hottest December of all time. So it's getting hotter. And if you look at the charts, it's also telling us that it's getting hotter even faster. So it's accelerating. It's not level. It's not even a straight line. It's an accelerating process. So while we are planning for recovery of flooding, we also need to be thinking about how are we going to plan for things like wildfires. When things get drier and hotter, let's look at our neighbors in South Carolina. Let's look at our neighbors in Los Angeles and learn from them, you know, what is it we need to do to prevent all those things from happening right here. So that's all I have to say for right now. We could sit here for a couple of days if you really wanted to, but and I can drill down on some really funny stories and hard times and lessons learned. But I really would like to hear from you guys. You know, how do you feel about it? Yeah.
May I ask how much federal, national funding was poured into this?
$200 billion is the total number of federal funds that were or federal and state